Hi everyone, welcome in. I can see some people saying hello on the chat already from London, from Munich, from Belgium, from Switzerland. Hi everyone, and welcome to our reward hours for July. Can't believe we're halfway through the year, already done 6 of these. But welcome in and thank you everyone for joining us today. So today we're going to be talking about benchmarking the edges. So niche roles, new titles, and what to do basically when the market data isn't there. And I'm very, very excited to have two of our amazing community members join us today for July's Reward Hour. We have Sunny Chatterjee and Alistair Fraser. I'll pass over to you both to do a quick round of introductions and then we can dive in. Sunny, you're on my left on the screen right now. So do you want to go first?
Sure, no problem. So hi, everyone. My name is Sunny Chatterjee. I'm the Total Rewards Director here at Showpad. That's a software SaaS type of company. I lead global compensation, benefits, job architecture, sales incentives across the entire organization. And it's evolved and grown significantly over a number of years through various mergers and acquisitions. Before Showpad, I worked in the aerospace sector, supporting highly specialized, specialized engineering populations, including actually things like the James Webb Space Telescope, for instance. And before that, I worked in the travel and leisure industry at TUI, also doing a Western European rewards role. Fun fact about me, I actually started off my career as a tax consultant. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Alistair.
Thanks, Sunny. Hey, yeah, so I'm Alistair. I'm an independent rewards consultant. I work for myself, consultancy of one. I've been doing that consulting since around 2018, helping essentially companies build fair pay practices. Prior to that, I held a couple of in-house roles as sort of head of director of people in a couple of high-growth tech startups. And then my fun fact is that prior to moving into startup land and being an HR consultant and so forth, I actually ran my own landscape design business.
Oh my God, amazing. So both fantastic fun facts. Thank you both for joining us today and sharing your insights with our audience as well. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Danica. I'm our community manager here at Ravio. And Ravio is on a mission to make compensation as less painful as possible to anyone that does reward. So as many might know, or our avid listeners who have been tuning in to Reward Hours for the last couple of months, we've been handing over the mic to members of our Reward Room community. So as Alistair and Sunny have said, the kind of experience that they have, real practitioners who are living through this stuff every single day. So as I said, today we're going to be talking about benchmarking niche and emerging roles. And benchmarking a generalist role can be, difficult enough. But benchmarking a role that barely exists on a survey or maybe even didn't exist a year or two ago can be a completely different problem in itself. The data can be thinner, the peer groups are harder to define, and then whatever approach you land on or think that you will take, you still need to kind of hold it up against the rest of your framework as well. So kind of how we mentioned before, today's conversation is about the practical reality of that, right? So how do you go from finding the answer when there's not something clear-cut on a spreadsheet? So what I would love to start off with and asking our audience with is a little poll, which I'm going to pop on the screen now. We like to start off our reward hours with a little poll. So we would love to know, what's your biggest challenge with niche or emerging roles at the moment? So is it finding any data at all? Is it knowing which data to trust? Is it keeping it consistent with the rest of your framework? Knowing how often to revisit this, or haven't hit the problem just yet, just here to learn from our two experts. Wow, okay, we've not had this before where we've had some zeros. So pretty much nearly everyone voting on there is our top two. So finding any data at all or knowing which data to trust. Okay, keeping it consistent coming up a little bit. Amazing. Perfect. Thank you all for that. So before I'm off, I'm going to hand the mic over to Sunny and Alistair. I want to start off, Alistair, by asking you, can you give us a sense about what niche and emerging kind of roles look like in your world when you're working with different companies? How often, do these come up when you're speaking to your clients, and what roles tend to kind of come on your desk as well? So I am going to drop off, leave it to the experts at the moment. And as we go along, please feel free to put any questions in the chat as well for Sun and Alistair to answer. But yeah, over to you guys.
Thanks. So I think, building on what Danica said there, I think the first thing obviously to establish is the difference between a niche and emerging role. How I tend to look at those is niche roles are roles that have been around for a while, but they are just niche to a particular industry, right? So think zookeepers, clinical technicians, kind of certain legal roles, right? They've existed for many, many years. They're just not particularly widespread in terms of sort of some of the standard salary benchmarking surveys, versus emerging roles, which are new, evolving. So, if you think back to when sort of OpenAI released ChatGPT, AI engineers sort of exploded back in sort of, 2022. They were emerging roles then. I'd say they've now started to become quite mainstream. And obviously, as I say, that's how I tend to look at them. And ultimately, those emerging roles are driven by new industries, new technology emerging. So ones I'm seeing personally, I'd be quite keen to hear what you think, Sunny, and sort of your niche versus emerging roles is, for me, emerging roles no longer such sort of AI or sort of machine learning type roles. I'm seeing sort of rocket propulsion engineers fall onto my lap. Other ones focused around EV, electric vehicle battery engineers. These are sort of some of the emerging roles which I'm starting to hear and sort of fall on my desk. And again, some of those standard surveys don't have them. Would you agree with those sort of two classifications?
Actually, I would. For me, completely aligned with the fact that niche roles are really more focused on a specific industry. I think the ones that I've come across a lot, if you've worked in an airline company, for instance, or every industry will have those, but for instance, an airline's operation controller, a baggage handler, these are roles that have existed for decades, but they're still niche, right? You don't have a lot of data about this.
Yeah.
And emerging, completely agree with you that AI, back in 2022, that was very much emerging. The thing that I'm seeing pop up as emerging right now, for instance, is a prompt engineer, right? So when you're working in a product and an engineering environment or not, everyone is rolling out Claude, ChatGPT, Codex, etc. across the business right now. They're trying to up-level their teams. And I get questions a lot about, hey, our product team wants to get in a prompt engineer. My first reaction was, okay, how do we go about that?
Yeah.
Right. And I think one thing to play off also is you mentioned that a role can be niche to one company, completely standard to another.
Yeah.
In your experience, how do you get a stakeholder or a client to accept that niche is relative, right? Because otherwise you're dealing with people's internal understanding of, hey, no, this is the way that the role is, and we have to compare it with other players in the market.
Yeah. I think that's when, I'd work with the client, my stakeholder, be it the HR team or the reward analyst that's perhaps in-house, just to sort of try and demonstrate, like, okay, they're saying it's not niche, we are. It's then a case of then looking into sample sites, like what numbers can we find behind this? Like, where do we gather the data? Is it from a traditional survey? And if it is from a traditional survey, like, what are the actual numbers, employee counts and employer or company counts that sit behind it, if that role does exist? So you might see, the other thing actually I find not frustrating, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, Sonny, is like when you log into something like Aon Radford or Mercer, some of the sort of incumbent providers out there, you'll see codes for roles, and you're like, hey, the data exists, it's in there, the code's in there, but actually there's no data behind it, because they haven't built up enough of a sample size to actually release that data set yet. So it's a tricky one to balance when you're working with a stakeholder who's telling you this isn't a niche role. Surely there's data, and we're like, there isn't any data. So it's, you know, kind of going backwards and forwards to try and demonstrate sample size and sort of present that back to the stakeholder to say, look, this is the data we can find. It's pretty thin on the ground. And then it's a case of asking them, well, you demonstrate to us where you've got the data from in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in my experience as well, I mean, taking example out of the, again, because I mentioned a baggage handler before, and it's sticking in my head for whatever reason. When I was faced with not having enough data, you're really trying to understand, you know, okay, you've got a baggage handler or you've got an ancillary revenue specialist. What does that, you know, my first question was, okay, big words, but what does that actually mean? What does the role do, right? So really trying to understand, getting behind the job title and really trying to understand what does, beyond whether it is a niche or emerging role or not, what is the problem that this role is solving, and what are the tasks, what is the scope, what is the complexity that they're faced with, tasks, responsibilities, really trying to get down to the nitty-gritty, because then at the end of the day you're able to compare, not necessarily with other immediate, you know, not necessarily in terms of a zookeeper, ancillary revenue specialist, but what skills and competencies actually overlap with other roles that exist externally in the market, but also internally within your company.
Yeah, I agree. I think the reason actually I like this topic is it kind of, you know, there's maybe your standard roles, and I can go into a company and help a company, and 100% of their roles, they're in the database that we're using, the survey. Great, fantastic. Well, you know, where this kind of keeps me personally on my toes is like, right, it's like acting like a bit like a detective, and it sort of helps me get creative. And part of that is I kind of feel like, I sort of use the analogy, I'm like a detective solving a crime. And as I say, you know, understanding, interrogating the witnesses, interrogating the hiring manager, asking them questions about, you know, the role. What are the skill sets? What, you know, that go beyond, as you say, the job title? Are there comparable roles internally? If not, you know, how did you create data? How did you, you know, come up with a number in the first place if you've already got someone employed in that role? If it's completely brand new to a company, then obviously they've come up with this role. There's a business need for it. Like, where is that job description? Why did they write it? Where are the comparables in the market? And as I say, it's like acting like a detective and not accepting their first answer or second answer. It's really drilling down deep. And yeah, I treat it like a bit of a kind of, a bit, not like a crime scene, but like a crime has happened and we need to solve it. As I say, also going beyond that, not just internally, right? If they're like, they give you a few clues, it's like reaching out to the market, speaking to recruiters, sort of cross-examining them and trying to sort of dig deep on recruiters who perhaps specialize in those roles. Giving them the brief, right? Giving them the job description and asking them, you know, what are your thoughts on this particular role?
No, absolutely. And just I like the phrasing of detective work, right? Because sometimes it really feels like that. I think just to touch base, just to touch base a little bit on that, because I think that might be useful. What questions do you really ask your clients, your internal stakeholders? Because I think some reward professionals I know, they have a playbook in terms of, okay, I'm going to ask this, and this question to really get to the bottom of it. How do you really go about this?
It's a good question. I think, yeah, first of all, start off with, look, do you have any comparable roles internally? What are they like? why are you actually not using the data from that? Because sometimes people will take a step back and go, you know what, it's actually really similar to role X, but it's a slight change in the skill set, but actually it matches 70% of that, 80% of that role. So there's actually an argument there. It's like, well, why not take the data for that role and then add on what you feel is a sensible and justifiable premium, and that can solve it quite quickly. Other times, if there's no role internally that exists, it's a case of, okay, well, what's the business need? Getting under the, as I said, the hood of the role, why you need that role. Other companies, I would always start with like other companies. Do you know anyone in the market that's actually, you know, got this role live or had it live in the past? I'd also, I think, always find that those hiring managers, those department heads, whoever's, you know, hiring for this niche or emerging role, they will inevitably have some type of external recruitment agency that they've used in the past in that company, in previous companies, something like that, where they'll be like, oh, let me introduce you to, you know, person X who works at recruitment XYZ, the agency we've used in the past. And then I'll say start to probably go down the road and start questioning them. And I find that those external recruiters have the sort of real-time street advice, like they're the informants on the street, right? That have the real credible information that perhaps the hiring manager won't perfectly have or had time to gather. Whereas those recruiters are, you know, those informants on the corner who you can go and lean upon. And as I say, the questions there, I think it's a case of keeping it pretty simple. Like, have you hired for this role? Where do you look? Have you made any similar placements recently? I think then depending on their answers, the questioning can go in a couple of different ways. But that's how I would start, for sure.
Absolutely. I think our methodologies are a little bit similar here, because I think in my opinion, the biggest mistake that people make, that we make within rewards, is also immediately thinking, you know, that, oh, there's no survey line data, there's no data available, we need more data. Actually, we need more understanding so we can compare it more internally or externally, right? So I completely follow you there. In terms of, you know, my methodology, my playbook, so to speak, is and I try to do this in all organizations that I work with, is really try to understand the work first, right? So I talk to the hiring manager in question or the department head. I try to steer away from HR, right? Because many of us are either working for HR teams, in HR teams, and it's very easy to get the rosy lenses and have your HR view on it, but actually it's better to get down in the weeds, speak to the business to get a real understanding of what the role does. Because then you'll, if and I saw this question pop up in the chat already of, you know, what do you do when the business demands that you want to pay a premium for the role, right? Because of you're not getting the candidates that you need, so you actually need to increase whatever rate that you're offering to get the candidates, and you can't really do that without speaking to the business first in terms of what skills, competencies are they really requiring here. And this is a new role, an emerging role, for instance. How do you really go about that? And taking all of this input, my second step would then be, you know, leveling it internally. What existing jobs are similar in terms of scope, competency, tasks, responsibilities, really aligning it to your job architecture. And only then would I really go towards the market, because then you have a formal understanding of how the business sees the role, what skills, competencies, task, responsibilities are important. And then you're looking at your external sources, like your Ravios of the world, if not, you know, other sources, or job grading sources. But I think another aspect that many of us in HR and finance that we discount is, you know, speaking to your recruiters in terms of what, you know, you're seeing some people, you're seeing some candidates. What are what are the candidate expectations? Because we often align ourselves to, you know, the survey line or the lack of data or the lack of trust. if candidate expectations are significantly higher than what you're offering, that already means that, okay, the pool that you're kind of fishing in doesn't match the job description, or the pricing that you've had of the job description.
Yeah.
So I try to combine these these candidate expectations with survey data, take into account professional association related data. Some of you may be enrolled in SHRM or in other communities that openly share data with each other. These are, I would say, good secondary or tertiary sources, and can help frame context. They shouldn't decide context, but they can help frame it. And finally, also industry reports, such as the report that Ravio creates, such as other reports which are publicly available. And ultimately, it gets you, in my opinion, to a confidence level, because you get to an idea of, okay, I have this amount of incumbents available in terms of survey data. My recruiters are telling me this in terms of candidate expectations. I'm getting this, I have a specific context that I'm getting from the business, because this is a business critical role. We are either willing to go above and beyond to attract the talent that we need because it solves a real world problem. And then it's really about, how do you go about that? And I try to categorize confidence levels as high, medium, or low, right? Kind of aligns with how many survey providers and data providers go about it. But the main thing that I try to do is I am very candid and transparent about this to the business internally, about, hey, this is my confidence level. This is why. This is the level of context. This is the internal research that we've done. And often when we're talking about emerging roles, not niche roles, when we're talking about emerging roles, what I'm seeing now is that we have a benchmark range. We respect the minimum of the range, but that we remove the maximum of the range. Specifically, when we're talking about AI engineers or prompt engineers, or the other time that I came across this was looking for a space system engineer to work together with your European Space Agency and NASA, for instance. And there you're really looking at, what is my available talent pool? And I have to get in the talent, and I'm willing to pay whatever premium that the business allows, given the financial nature of the problem that the role is solving. And then it becomes a financial discussion. Right? So in terms of a playbook, that's really the 4 steps that I try to take. And on the data itself, I always like to say, one data point is evidence. It isn't truth, right? It's far from the truth. So you always try to get multiple data sources, even if they don't have a lot of incumbents. You try to scrape job boards. You try to get candidate expectations from your recruiters, and you try to get all of these, other sources to kind of build your internal business case. But I know, I know that I've been going on a little bit about this, and because I'm a little bit passionate about it. But moving it back to you, Alistair. So let's say you've got the numbers that you trust, right? I mentioned already that you might be using one source, you might be using multiple sources. I think in your role as a consultant, you're often involved in multiple sources. How do you really blend these to get to your desired result, and how do you keep that consistent with the rest of the compensation framework?
I think it's quite natural for companies to have multiple sources. I think, even if you don't have any, let's say you don't even have any emerging or niche roles, it is good practice, if budget is available, to look at a couple of different sources, right? So using Ravio alongside perhaps another source, even if all your roles are in there, fantastic. No roles, perhaps Ravio's got a blind spot on a couple of roles, say an aerospace engineer or a zookeeper role or something like that, right? you are going to need to complement that with another source. And I think it's fine to have multiple sources. It's just all it comes down to, in my opinion, is documenting the sources that you've used, why you've used multiple sources, perhaps where you've used those sources to triangulate on that niche role or that emerging role, to say, look, we've actually gone out to market, we've spoken to recruiters, we've looked at specialist reports and so forth. I think, as I say, it always comes back, everything always comes back to transparency. And if you're using multiple sources, you reference those multiple sources in your comp philosophy, and that's obviously something you want to document and communicate to your employees. Again, using that sort of analogy, right, of acting as a detective and presenting your case in the courts, right? You got to, I guess in some cases perhaps not, but in most cases, prove where this evidence has come from. You've got to perhaps name the witnesses, name the sources of how you collected that evidence. In most cases, right, in law, but to use that as that sort of continuing analogy. I guess the tricky bit when using some of those sources, though, and this is something I've come up against, so perhaps you are going to use a recruitment report from a specialist agency. What I have struggled with, and I'll be quite keen to hear what your view on this is, Sonny, is in Ravio you have your role, your levels, and then your market position across the different percentiles. When you look at a recruitment report, it's typically maybe some levels, maybe 4 or 5 levels, not the nice sort of standardized framework that Ravio and other providers use. And you don't get any market percentiles. You might get a min, mid, and max, or you might just get a midpoint. I guess the question is, and this is something that I'm not going to answer, I'd be keen to hear what you say, is like, if your pay philosophy is we want to pay in the 75th percentile, how do you know if that data from that recruitment report is in the 75th percentile or the 50th or the 90th? It doesn't tell you that. I'd be keen just to hear like your view on that and your answer, because that's something I've been challenged on a few times when we've lent on an external report that doesn't give you a percentile. Sometimes it won't give you validation on what a level 1, 2, 3, 4 is. It's like you're kind of guessing and going on the job title perhaps. Yeah. So it's hard to compare apples to apples with those, and that's something that I would always flag with a client. It's not going to be perhaps a perfect match when you're trying to do that triangulation exercise, but on the percentiles, you're committing as a business to pay in the 75th. How do you know that recruitment report is in the 75th?
Absolutely.
I don't know. It's a tricky one.
It is a tricky one, because for me, it's really hard to, especially when dealing with these type of bespoke recruiting reports, right? Because like you say, you don't really know what it is based on. They tend not to share the scope of incumbents or which companies are involved in the incumbents, and that makes that already drops my confidence level from high to medium just straight off the bat, right? But in terms of validation, in terms of letting me understand, is this data that I can use? And this is not going to be for everybody, but this is something that I do and something that my teams do. But we actually use pay differentials. So with tools like Ravio, with other tools which are available, you can actually calculate in the back end, okay, what do the majority of my roles cost in my most prevalent market? Let me look up economic factors such as wage inflation. Let me look at not so much the cost of living, but the cost of labor differentials, which are available across different regions or across different countries. And let me model it out for myself just statistically speaking, based off of the information that I have. What if a software engineer, that I'm hiring in Chicago, for instance, how much is that software engineer going to cost me in Belgium or in the Netherlands, just purely based off of economic factors, not really looking at survey line data. And I use that as a secondary source to validate these type of bespoke recruitment reports just to give me kind of a line in the sand, or just a sense check of, does this information make sense, or are we way off? And if we're in the same ballpark figure, then I tend to trust the report a little bit further to increase my confidence level again. If it's way off, then if I have access to the recruiter, to the recruitment agency that provided the report, I tend to ask some questions, or I'm likely to disregard the report entirely. I'm going to be honest with you. So that's kind of the way that I deal with it. It's a very statistical approach. It might be for some, not so much for others, but it's just the way that I like to deal with it, because I can defend it internally.
Yeah. I guess another question on that sort of internal defense, like, have you, when you've gone out to market to look for different sources, have you ever worked internally or with a provider to create a bespoke report? Have you ever gone down that route? Because I work with a client who the data was really sparse. It was a niche role. It wasn't an emerging role. It was a niche role. It's been around for a long, long time. It was an aircraft leasing company. There's not many people who have the skill set in aircraft leasing. And in the end, that client decided there just wasn't enough data out there that could build up the trust and credibility internally. So they actually then commissioned an external report from one of the big vendors to build that trust. And they did. Ultimately, have you gone down that route before?
Yeah, so especially when you're especially for niche roles in a niche market, I'll reference the airline industry, for instance, like you did. When you're dealing with aircraft maintenance technicians, for instance, you absolutely need to go the club survey route. Seek out a data provider that is willing to do the club survey for you, such as a Ravio. There are a plethora of providers out there that can facilitate that. And it's really about gathering a peer group of interested peer companies. Unfortunately, you do have to do some of the lifting yourselves and leverage that network and get out there, speak to people, gauge interest in terms of sharing information in a confidential way, so that all participants get that information. But when you do, if you do, you do gain a lot of trust internally. You do create a lot of data. It is something that you can then kind of leverage in terms of your network, not just once, but moving forward, that you can also bring to a board or to a C-level, and it is appreciated quite a lot. In my experience, at least in the airline industry, it solved a lot of frustration, because it removed the essence of the element of doubt, and it allowed us to kind of negotiate with works councils, for instance, in a much more open way, in a much more definitive way.
Yeah, I think, as you say, all of the above, albeit that only really works for niche roles. The emerging roles that I'm seeing out there, if you were to go out and try and create a similar, blueprint of finding like-minded companies to do this, I find it a lot harder. They're like, well, these roles don't exist. We don't even know a lot of the companies. We don't even really know a lot of the peers that we should be contacting. And I'll hear, someone say, look, we just don't have time, right? We need to hire these 10 rocket propulsion engineers in the next 12 months. We can't wait 6 to 12 months to do a survey, Alistair. So for those surveys, I find fantastic for niche roles, but for emerging roles, slightly harder to gain traction. And obviously there's a cost element to them as well, which might make it prohibitive to smaller companies. But I think the thing I always say is, like, benchmarking data, yes, it comes with a cost. Some people don't want to spend money on it, but you think about, it's peanuts compared to, like, when you're building that level of trust and credibility with your comp philosophy and your strategy, not just for employees or the hiring managers, but, like you say, up to board level. So yeah, I think the other thing, in terms of when we're trying to create that trust, how do you personally, Sonny, how do you go about, once you've started collecting all this evidence, you talked about all these different sources. What do you personally do, or what does your team personally do when, documenting it all? Where do you keep it, like a list of all of the sources? How do you go about that? I'd be curious. I've got my methods. I'd be keen to hear what you do.
No, absolutely. This is kind of like the science behind the madness, right? So in principle, so I try to align first and foremost, get a clear-cut, defined compensation philosophy. You can't reiterate how important that is, that it's not something just living within HR, but that is something that is known within your executive team and known across the business, right? That it's really a fundamental part of your talent strategy. Once you know your pay position, and you translate that into your compensation philosophy, it's really about getting your elbows dirty, so to speak, gathering all of the data exports of all of the sources that you're using. And what me and my team, specifically you, do is we try to match all of these survey data roles to each other. We do this internally, and it is, especially now with the advent of AI and Claude, we are actually enabled to do so, and it's never been easier to do than it is today. So we call this the Rosetta Stone document internally, where we are matching survey data of 3 separate sources, and then once we do this match, then we match it back to our internal roles. Right, so we're aggregating multiple data sources with one another. We have a subset of policies, a subset of principles in terms of where do we apply a market premium, right, for specific markets, because we are either basing ourselves on general market data, but we're located in the capital city, and we're aware that in that capital city, salaries tend to be a little bit higher than in the rest of the country, right? Or for which departments or which specific teams or roles would we hire at a higher market, at a higher pay position, market premium, for instance, compared to other roles. Now, when we do this, there's a governance process behind it. We need specific finance approvals from our CFO, etc., in order to get this sorted. But it's really, like you said at the start of this call, Alistair, it's about documentation. Because if you lose track of all of these micro decisions, right, you lose the structure and it just becomes chaos. So we have all of these micro decisions collated in a base file that we use for all of it. We call it, well, it's our compensation data file, but it's essentially our operating model. And in that way, we are able to scale our rewards operations quite considerably with pretty limited headcount. So that's how we're tackling it internally here. How about yourself? How are clients that you're seeing dealing with this specific problem? Because I'd like to flip the question now.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I can give you sort of an example. If I think back a kind of couple of years now, when sort of the AI roles are slightly more on that, so we say the emerging side. I think there are, it's simply really, if I had to break it down into proper baby steps, is, does it exist in that client's existing database? Does it exist in the Ravio or the PAVE database? Is there budget to, if it's an emerging role, is there budget to actually purchase another survey? Rather than purchase a whole new provider, does that provider, some providers out there actually give you one-off benchmarks? So, again, not to sort of promote too much other providers, but there is the ability sometimes to buy single jobs rather than invest in a whole database and spend, 7,000-8,000 euros. Just for one role. You can purchase one-off roles, and some providers do that. Documenting the data from recruiters, literally down to the recruiter's name, email address, the number that they gave us, the evidence behind that, With the advent of call recordings, even a summary or a link off to the call that you perhaps had that with that recruiter, like all of that micro evidence. Imagine it's, again, using that detective analogy, like those brown boxes that sit in those dusty rooms that get pulled out. Like, you need everything, because essentially when you present it back to the employees, the hiring manager, the CFO, the CEO, think of them as like the courts. You've got to have everything watertight. So, I've used in that similar case, we were literally going off and looking at jobs in the West Coast, over in San Francisco, predominantly of some of the big tech firms. And one of the things actually I learned really importantly is we were finding jobs and saying Microsoft's paying this and OpenAI is paying that and so forth. We were putting in the URLs to those job adverts, right? And those job adverts then, died a couple of months later when they got pulled offline. Biggest learning for me is don't just rely on the URL, screenshot the job advert and document that. Just put it in your evidence file, because URLs die and obviously screenshots don't. And using all of that data is then kind of looking across it, and as I say, looking at similar numbers, how similar they are, confidence levels. I'm confident in this being a really good number. I trust this recruiter. They've hired 15 of these roles in the last 2 months and so forth. And as I say, building that up, spreadsheet, Google Docs, whatever works for an individual. But that evidence is absolutely critical, because it's really easy to think, I won't forget about this. I won't forget where that number came from. And time after time, I've seen, people alongside a lovely, data set from Ravio drop in this like random number for a niche or emerging role. And everyone's scratching their head in 6 months' time going, where did this number come from? Who came up with that? Sometimes, just sort of final point on sort of maybe taking a step back. Maybe there's only 2 or 3 data points. Maybe there's only a data point for, a entry level and mid-level role, emerging role or niche role, but you want to build out data for all of your levels. It's important to document. Sometimes, again, I've seen the numbers in there and there's levels 1 to 6, but we've only got 2 numbers. It's like, how did you fill in the missing pieces? What regression sort of did you use to do that? Again, that needs to form part of your evidence. Otherwise, sometimes, again, I've seen these numbers in there and people go, well, where have they come from? We only looked at two roles, and you've got 6 essentially levels, aka roles in there. So, it's like making sure everything is like forensically watertight. Otherwise, you'll present it back, and the hiring manager go, "Don't believe it, don't load of crap," and you're just like, "That's hours of work gone down the drain."
Absolutely.
So I think that's my key takeaway when you do this.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think I think people in my team have heard me say also that the core currency that we're trading is really trust.
Yeah,
your core currency is trust, because at the end of the day, if we want to work as efficiently as possible as reward professionals, it's really, you have to gain that trust and you have to keep it every day. And I think another example of this is really, and I saw this, not just about documentation, it's also about reviewing the data that you have, right? And I think this is particularly relevant for niche and emerging roles. For niche roles, I kind of treat the same way I would do any other. I would treat a niche role the same way I would treat a finance role. I would just review it at the same cadence, for instance, as the rest of the organization. But for an emerging role, I'd actually review it semi-annually at least. Because for these type of roles, if your documentation is 6 months old, right, you may already be past it. So all of this, you have to unfortunately stay up to speed and keep your evidence pool pretty tight, pretty recent, in order to keep making that business case, because your internal stakeholders, your people partners, your HR business partners, they will come to you because they had one supreme fantastic hire or candidate who declined the offer because of compensation, and they'll come back to you and say, hey, no, we don't trust the data, right? If you can't say that the data wasn't recent, you already, you haven't lost the battle, but you're starting on a weak foot there. So for emerging roles, they really require that extra level of attention, in my opinion. Definitely more than twice a year. For the rest of your organization, I would stick to whatever cadence that you have currently. And maybe a question for you. What is a sign for you? Because I know you're really at the forefront in terms of the data aspect. So what is the fastest sign for you that a benchmark midpoint for a specific emerging role has drifted too far from what you've, from your initial proposal, you could say? And how do you deal with, the fact that benchmarks are also inherently like a lagging indicator, right? So how do you combine those aspects?
I think, with the emerging roles, I agree. I think you do need to be checking them a lot more often. What is the, I guess, rationale to do, or no, sorry, what's the, I'm just trying to think of the word here. Why would you do it more often? I think, or what would be the reason to do it more often? I think usually time after time, what I hear, to your point, is rejected offers. So the recruitment team, the TA team, telling you that the numbers they're going out to market for this prompt engineer, you're just getting rejection after rejection. Or maybe it's not rejection, but in those early stages where you're understanding what candidate expectations are, not what the candidates are, but candidate expectations are. And if they are like completely out of whack, I think it's a case, again, depending on how the TA team, communicates to the wider HR team or the rewards team, if you've got one, if there's a sort of regular meeting where it's like, I would have down in that weekly meeting or bi-weekly meeting, depending on obviously how often it happens, always a standing agenda item on like anyone struggling with comp right now, anyone going out to market and hearing things different to the bands that we have. And that's usually the reason as to why people come to me and say, look, Alistair, we need to look at our benchmarks again for that prompt engineer or that emerging role, because we're just getting a completely different, noise from the market. The market's telling us we need to be 10, 15% higher. I guess then it's a case of, well, let's look back at the evidence. Let's look back at those, revisit those benchmarks. Is it something that has changed? Or is it actually just the case that we need to improve our competitive position? Again, it depends on whether the data and the evidence is percentile based, or it's just literally single digit numbers from those different sources. So it is a bit more legwork to look after those emerging roles for sure. But those emerging roles tend to be, again, the ones where, they're critical to the business and they're a scarce role in the market, which makes them quite unique. And then they're going to command that premium anyway.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it can be a full-time role if you've got lots of emerging roles, like, working in some of the businesses I've helped, where half the business are these, blockchain engineers, but like some really unique blockchain, again, well over my head. So yeah, it is a full-time role in some cases for some businesses, unfortunately.
100% agree. One of the, let's say, I think my first comment on that, you made a point about, having that weekly meeting with either the HR team or like that, or your client or the cadence. I think that's key. I think someone asked in the chat already about what the role of the people partner is in this entire process. And I think, especially when you're dealing with emerging roles, the first person that you have to convince is your HR business partner or your HR director, in terms of having them understand the data, having them understand the problems of the role, the intricacies of the role, because they are also they're also business facing. and having them understand, the difficulties, right, of the lack of data, all of the workarounds that you as a reward professional are really introducing to get somewhat credible level of data helps you get continue that trust. So for me, my TA team is kind of my eyes and ears, but my HR business partners, they are, as a reward professional, they are my number one partners. You have to leverage them not only to remain credible within the business, because we are centers of expertise within an organization, right? We're not directly facing the business. So really that partnership remains absolutely key, so that you can convince your HR business partners, your people partners, that what you are doing and your methodology is sound. So that trust is there, and they will be your biggest champion towards the business to effectuate, or to actually just follow your proposal, right, rather than be a blocker. So in that sense, for me at least, it's a really important stakeholder to manage first. Another question that's come up, it's really about AI disruption, and I think someone posted in the chat of employees often coming with confident-looking salary benchmarking reports in seconds. Before I answer it, how do you usually push back on AI-generated compensation data?
Well, there's an article that Ravio have put out recently on this. So first and foremost, I push people to look at that. It's a really well written article. It's super patchy. The way that AI will go out and scrape data, looking typically, it uses, I guess, from what I understand, it will look at job titles. It will look at all of these disparate sources. It gets skewed to the US. I personally would just discount it completely. What I've been doing recently as part of some of the compensation philosophies that I help companies produce as part of the FAQs and part of the manager training, there's a specific section in the comp philosophy. There's a specific part of the training that I deliver. It's all around how to push back on and politely push back on AI generated data. So yeah, I mean it's a reasonably juicy topic to dive into. I'm just conscious of the time that we've got left, but certainly not something that I would encourage companies to use. So yeah, you could ask AI to produce a salary for a particular niche role or emerging role. You could prompt the same tool 10 times and you could get 10 different answers, quite frankly. And that's the evidence alone.
100%.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I completely agree with you there, Alistair. And also cognizant of time, from my point of view, also, the way that I have and I continue to advise leaders within my organization is that the data that an AI, a large language model, provides is totally devoid of any strategy, right? It doesn't align with your business's reality, right? Because at the end of the day, your pay position is not only set within you in an ivory tower in HR, right? It's set by the business in coordination with an executive team or a board. So you're making some decisions in terms of who you're comparing yourself to, what type of sample size, what type of companies are you comparing yourself to? Are you comparing yourself to companies between 200 and 500 FTE, to companies between 1,000
exactly.
and 2,000? And that skews the data so much, because then you're not only looking at your base pay or OTE, total target cash compensation package, you're also looking at equity and these type of things. So really getting your scope in terms of who you are comparing yourself to, it skews the data completely, and it makes whatever salary range that an AI engine can produce moot. Usually when you can convey it this way to your leaders, it makes sense, because you're relaying the strategic decision behind it. And often, especially if it's executives, they were in the room when you decided it, right? So it calms the nerves already a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's typically how I tend to go about it.
There's so many things wrong with AI generated data. It's just it's easy to prove to an employee when you say, for reasons XYZ, we don't use it, and then they'll be like, yeah, that actually makes sense. Like, we don't pay 40,000, we pay 25 or whatever the number is. But remember, we do all these other things. Does that other company do those things? Oh, you don't know the companies? Like, it's just, we offer equity, they don't. It's just, there's no comparison. Cool. I think we're coming up to time. Hopefully we've covered everything. Do we want to jump into some of the questions?
Yes, let's do it. We have a couple of minutes.
Let's have a look here. Do we have, I'm just having a look through some of the questions here. So, I mean, I could start from the top. Let's have a look here. Let's have a look. I'm just looking through the questions. So Hannah's put in here, how much lag do you typically factor in from job boards, as we know the data is often aged? Good question. When you say the data is often aged, I don't know. I mean, it might be aged, it might not be. You don't know how recent that job is, I guess. Personally, I would take data from a job advert as relevant at that moment in time. I don't know if you agree with that, Sunny.
100%. My base assumption, though, that whatever data that you're seeing on a job board is at least 6 months old. I mean, being realistic, right? And taking our discussion about emerging roles specifically, I tend to disregard job board information regarding emerging roles because they're all over the place and the quality really differs. So for other niche type of roles, I think it could work, but similarly, I think my base expectation is benchmarks are inherently a lagging indicator. I'm looking at external data, and I'm thinking it's at least 6 months old. And then you, as a reward professional, you have to kind of decide for yourself, okay, is this within an acceptable level of confidence for me and my business, and move forward with that.
There's another one here from Erica. It says, we've spoken about using a premium, but how to know how much the premium should be. So if the role is 70% same, for example. So how I'm reading that is, let's say it's people operations. So actually, a company I was speaking to the other day, they've got someone in people operations, but that person is people operations engineer, right? They've got a people operations person who's specialized in AI engineering and prompt engineering. I guess there it's a question. I think first thing is, do you pay a people operations rate and add a premium on for the AI, or do you pay an AI or a prompt engineer rate and a discount? That would be my first thing. So there's a premium and a discount there. But again, I guess using that as an example, how do you approach that and determining the premium, or in this case, as I said there, possibly a discount?
First of all, I think it depends on your current company's pay position and how tight or loose budgets are. If budget isn't a problem, I would just go forward with the prompt engineering benchmark, for instance, because the overall goal for us within rewards is to retain talent, right? That is the ultimate goal of retaining the best possible talent. So we want to facilitate that. And that's why these are the decisions that I would kind of propose of, hey, okay, if the money matter is off of the table, let's go with the higher benchmark. Yeah. If budgets are tight, typically then I would go for, because you're looking at skills and competencies, I would still base myself on the prompt engineering benchmark, but then discount the midpoint slightly, like you also alluded to, because you're kind of mixing two different job codes, you're mixing two different data points, but you don't want to outright go to the lower data point and then have this individual who does have the necessary skills and competencies to do a job at a higher level, and limit them, because then you have a retention problem within 12 to 18 months.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we are nearly at time. So I know, Alistair, sorry for popping up just there very quickly, but thank you both so much. I'm sure we probably could have spoken about this for another hour, so maybe we do a part 2. I've put the link to joining the community on the screen at the moment. So for those of you that don't know, we also have a reward community. Like I said, Sunny and Alistair are part of that, where we have conversations like this on the daily, on the regular. So if you are interested, please follow the link, and we would love to see you there. But then a massive thank you, Sunny and Alistair, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their week and weekend. Thank you all.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.